Hello everybody, welcome back to Polymath. My name is Dan, and today I want to talk to you about stress. Now I imagine stress is something that you've definitely felt before, and that you might be feeling a lot of right now. There is a mental health crisis going on. And I think in light of all that, it's really important to just dissect this phenomenon and just sort of talk about what scientifically stress actually is. The first really key concept to understand is that stress is not the same as distress. So when I say the word stress, you probably think of like this negative emotional response and maybe physiological symptoms that go along with that response. So stuff like your heart beating faster, your palms getting sweaty. That's distress. That's just a type of stress. What stress actually is, when we zoom out a little bit, stress is really just a sort of taxation of the body system. It's about how much your body systems are being used. So for example, when you stretch an elastic band and you're sort of taxing it more, you're using more of it. You're kind of putting more pressure on it. You're making it do more stuff to respond to the force you're exerting on it. You're putting stress on that elastic band. Your body's the exact same. Stress is really just the taxation of sort of how much nervous system activity is going on, how much hormonal or endocrine system activity is going on, how much various areas of your brains are active, how much psychological importance or salience you're attributing to something. It's just, so stress really is just the taxation, the use of your mind and your body's systems. But the valence of that, so valence is how emotionally that feels, can be good or bad. So eustress, EU stress, so EU is just the prefix for good, so like utopia, for example, although that's spelled with a U and not EU. There's eustress, which feels good. Eustress is like stimulation. Because in fact, if you were never stimulated, if you were never challenged, you'd be really bored. So if your mind and your body systems weren't being taxed at all, if you never, let's say, exercised, or you never had to think about anything, you probably wouldn't be that happy. You wouldn't like that. At the same time, distress, when those mind and those body systems are being taxed in a negative way, we don't like that. That feels bad. I'm just going to adjust this camera so you're not getting just my silly head. So, stress. So, a really important concept to understanding this is that stress is both a psychological and a physiological response. It's something that we think about. It's a process that happens in our mind, but it's also a process that happens in our body. And there's lots of different systems of the body involved in that. So our nervous system, our endocrine system, our immune systems, really examples of three key systems where the stress response causes these to kick into action a bit more. So you might have heard of the concept of homeostasis. You might remember that from like GCSE biology, I don't know. Homeostasis is just your body trying to keep a consistent internal environment. So for example, we like our blood sugar to be in a certain level. We like our sort of body temperature to be within a certain range. Allostasis refers to changes in your internal environment to respond to your external environment. So for example, let's say someone's chasing you, right? Your external environment is presenting a threat. You need to respond to that threat. But actually, there needs to be some kind of changes inside your body to help you respond to that. So you'd want maybe increased blood flow to your muscles. You'd want your body to stop focusing on like the immune system or digestion and start focusing on moving and getting out of there. You'd want your heart rate to go up so you can get more oxygen to the cells in your body that need it. So allostasis is this evolutionary adaptive process so adaptive means evolutionarily beneficial. It evolved for a reason. Of your internal environment adapting, so changing to meet the needs of your external environment. And the allostatic load is basically the degree to which your internal environment is changing. So stress really is just allostatic load. And that allostatic load manifests itself in increase in various systems in the body, and an increase of activity in a sort of system in the brain called the limbic system. You might have heard of the limbic system. The limbic system is just a part of your brain that generates emotion. It's an emotional guidance system that, based on past experiences and based on the life experiences that you've already had, appraises a situation and generates an emotional response to this. And the limbic system is just a set of structures in your brain which all work together to do this. So the amygdala is a really classic example of this. By the way, when people talk about the amygdala, there's not just one amygdala in your brain. So your brain has two hemispheres. In each of these hemispheres, so in any component of the limbic system, there's two of them in your brain, one for each hemisphere. So there's a left amygdala, there's a right amygdala. There's a left hippocampus, there's a right hippocampus, etc., etc., etc. So your amygdala is what generates emotional affect. So just to say what that means, it's what generates that actual emotion. Your amygdala is just a part of your brain that assigns an emotion to a stimulus. And that's both positive and negative emotion. So the amygdala is responsible for stuff like fear and aggression, but it's also responsible for like feelings of nourishment and trust. There's the hippocampus, which is the part of your brain that makes memories. It's not responsible for storing long-term memory. The hippocampus is a memory maker. There's also lots of other sort of structures of the limbic system and different, like there's no universal consensus on everything in the limbic system, but there is like a general consensus on the structures that tend to be included in the limbic system. So the amygdala and the the amygdala and hippocampus, they're always included in the limbic system. But there's also the hypothalamus, which is sort of responsible for the connection between your nervous system and your endocrine system. More on that in a bit. It's also responsible for homeostasis. Your hypothalamus is one of the bits of your brain responsible for like the drive to eat and the desire to run away when you're scared, or the sort of desire to have sex, for example. There's the septal nuclei, which are these sort of sets of structures in your brain responsible for pleasure and reward. There's the cingulate gyrus, which is a bit in the cerebral cortex. So the cerebral cortex is the top layer of the brain. That's also part of the limbic system. So the limbic system is stuff that's subcortical, so it's structures that are below the cortex of the brain, and the limbic system is also cortical structures. So the cingulate gyrus is one of these structures, and it's responsible for like decision making, emotional regulation, prioritizing different courses of action, etc., etc. And there's also another bit of structures called the mammillary nuclei, responsible for remembering things, so recollective memory. That's subcortical. So you have all these different sort of structures in the limbic system. The limbic system, it's what generates this kind of, it's the psychological component of stress. And it's not all bad. So as we said earlier, the amygdala gives you good feelings as well as bad feelings. But basically, the more allostatic load, the greater the activity of this limbic system, the more it kicks into gear. So allostatic load, not necessarily, it's not a valence for long, it can be good or bad. However, excessive and prolonged activation of this response is bad. So eustress, so the good kind of stress, tends to be short-lived and it tends to be quite moderate in intensity. When your limbic system massively kicks into gear, or when it's in gear for a long time, that's bad. We experience that as distress. So all these kind of the stress response that happens in your body, all the systems that kick in your life, sort of like kick into gear during the stress response, they're initiated by the limbic system. So the two really important systems to talk about here are the nervous system, so the nerves in your body, and the endocrine system, the sort of hormonal system in your body, how all the hormones work. And what happens is when there's this stress response, so the stress response kicks in like 20 milliseconds after a kind of stimulus in the environment. Within 10 milliseconds of a stimulus in the environment, your brain responds automatically. So that limbic system kicks into gear really quickly. Whereas consciously, you only start to cognitively think about how you're going to respond to a situation about a few hundred milliseconds after that stimulus. So while the stress response is both emotional and cognitive, so it encompasses both the emotions you feel and what you're thinking in your head, the cognitive bit comes way later than the emotional bit. The emotions come rapidly. You get this really rapid emotional response. The cognitive response comes after. And that activity of the limbic system, so it activates a part of the nervous system in the body called the sympathetic nervous system. The sympathetic nervous system is just a division of the nervous system in your body. It's just a bit of the nervous system which you don't have any control over, which basically primes your body's organs into a fight or flight response. So when the sympathetic nervous system gets activated, when your brain generates this stress response and switches on the sympathetic nervous system, it basically signals to all the parts of your brain, all the parts of the body, get ready, we're doing stuff now. So the key sort of neurotransmitters involved in this, the key kind of chemicals involved in the sympathetic nervous system are adrenaline and noradrenaline. You've probably heard of these two hormones. Adrenaline is what does stuff like increase your heart rate or dilate your pupils or kind of switch blood supply from the digestive bits of your body to the muscles in your body. Adrenaline has actions on all the different bits of your body. And it's what kind of primes you into action. So that's the sort of nervous response to stress. It's the nervous system's response to stress. That's really, really quick. So almost immediately after a stimulus, a stressor in the environment, the kind of world that you live in, that kicks into gear. What's slower is the endocrine system's response, the hormonal response. So that kicks into gear later. So what we talked about as part of that limbic system is the hypothalamus. And what happens in the stress response is that your hypothalamus signals to the pituitary gland, okay, start making hormones. And those hormones produced by the pituitary gland then go down to another organ in your body called the adrenal glands. And the adrenal glands is what, for example, makes adrenaline. So you can see the nervous system and the endocrine system, they're linked together. They're strongly connected to each other. They're not entirely separate. However, they are different phenomena. So the adrenal glands, they create adrenaline, but they also create other stress response hormones like cortisol. You may have also heard of cortisol. Now, keep in mind, just as we've been saying that stress isn't always bad, stress hormones and cortisol isn't always bad. So the event that happens, so if you look at if you rank the amount of cortisol released in your body, and you sort of see which events in the external environment cause the greatest release of cortisol, the thing that causes the greatest release of cortisol is sexual behavior. So when you're having sex, for example, there's this massive surge in cortisol in your body. That's not bad. That's not because most people tend to quite enjoy shagging. However, it is something which taxes the body's systems quite a lot. So cortisol is one of the hormones which sort of kicks into gear and manages that. Now, cortisol is also released in stress, and as we'll see, it's released in distress and in chronic distress. But again, it's not universally bad. There's other hormones involved, for example, by the way, but because I want to make this quite a short video, I'm just going to sort of go into cortisol. And again, the actions of cortisol are a bit slower. So, for example, if you give someone a stressful stimulus, if you give someone a stressor, then adrenaline rises up, it peaks, and then it returns to pre-existing levels after 45 minutes. So 45 minutes after the stressor, the nervous system has gone, ooh, weird sound effect, I don't know what that was. It's gone, oil, and it's just gone back to normal. Whereas cortisol still doesn't return to baseline after 60 minutes. So here's the thing. The stuff that cortisol does is really, really useful for a short-term situation when we need to do stuff, but it's really quite bad when we have a long-term raised cortisol. So what does cortisol do? Cortisol does stuff like it raises your blood pressure. It causes the tissues in your body to retain more fluid. It raises blood sugar. It raises the amount of fat circulating through the blood. It decreases the sort of activity it sort of deregulates the immune system. It makes your immune system worse. It's doing its job. It also suppresses healing. It sort of decreases the synthesis of new bone. You lose collagen. So collagen it does loads of things in the body, but it's one of the things that makes your skin look younger, for example. It causes resistance to insulin. It decreases the lifespan of your cells. Now, all of that is fine when you're just having these short-term stress responses. When a stressful thing happens, you deal with it, it goes back to normal. And eustress, the good kind of stress, follows this kind of pattern. However, here's the thing. When you're chronically stressed, if you're stressed all the time, if you're constantly experiencing distress, you get these things going on all the time. And that's not good. And ironically, actually, when we look at loads of chronic diseases, the kind of stuff that fills up GP surgeries, they show the exact same symptoms. So the symptomology, the typology of symptoms that we see with a chronic stress response is the same constellation of symptoms that we see with lots of chronic diseases. So the short-term threat response is very evolutionarily adaptive. It helps us get stuff done. It helps us survive. Long-term, it's not good at all. And another thing that happens is when you experience chronic stress, your brain changes as a result of that. Your limbic system changes as a result of being chronically distressed. So your amygdala gets bigger. It becomes better at monitoring threats. Your hippocampus gets smaller, so the memory maker in your brain gets smaller, and the complexity of connections between the hippocampus and other areas of your brain gets reduced as well. So you lose that connectivity too. There's also less neurogenesis and neuroplasticity. So neuroplasticity is basically your brain's capacity to constantly change itself and sort of reshape itself and update itself and according to the environment. And neuroplasticity is good. It's good for our well-being. It's good for our cognitive functioning. Neurogenesis is the creation of new brain cells. So it's sort of the creation of new neurons for our brain. The chronic stress response suppresses both of these things. And cortisol, again, it weakens the immune system's ability, as I said, but cortisol ramps up inflammation in the body. And it causes these pro-inflammatory chemicals called pro-inflammatory cytokines to ramp up production in the body. And it also suppresses the production of stuff like serotonin, dopamine, noradrenaline. So the chronic stress response is really, it's not great. It's not really what you want. And as you can imagine, as a result of all this stuff on blood pressure and blood sugar, the cardiovascular effects caused by the chronic stress response are quite negative. So for example, there was this really, really famous study in British civil servants in 1978 in Whitehall, and it found that lower ranking civil servants actually had way worse cardiovascular health than higher ranking civil servants because they were just more stressed out basically. And if you're more stressed out, if you experience more distress, you're more likely to have a higher blood pressure, narrower blood vessels, so that increases your likelihood of heart attacks, strokes. It causes muscle atrophy. It causes a decrease in wound healing. You're more likely to get ulcers in the body. So stomach ulcers, for example, are famously psychosomatic. So they're caused by both bodily causes and mental, like psychological causes. So you're more likely to get ulcers if you're more distressed. You also have a weaker immune system. What I really want to impress here is that there's a very strong link between the mind and the body. So this psychosomatic link, this link between the mind and the body, that's not some kind of like wishy-washy, hippie, like fringe belief. That's just basic science. We know that there's a really strong link between the different systems of the body and between the mind and the body. And in fact, there's a whole subfield of medicine called psychoneuroimmunology, which is all about this connection between the mind and your psychology, the nervous system, and the immune system. You also get a lot of indirect damage from chronic distress, because chronic distress, when you're stressed out, it inhibits rational, sensible decision making in the brain. And also, and it means that you're more likely to turn to things like to coping mechanisms such as alcohol or drug use or smoking or binge eating or bad social habits or hanging out with the wrong people, all this kind of stuff. And then that leads to adverse life consequences in different ways. And that all sounds really, really stressful. I appreciate that all sounds really, really scary. But don't worry, because all this is really sort of telling you guys, okay, distress is bad and I need to de-stress. But you're not telling me how to do that. But I have a whole podcast. I've done a whole other project telling you all about how to de-stress and how to be happy. And it's this podcast on Spotify and YouTube called Understanding Happiness, Science of the Buddha. It's not monetized. There's no ads. There's no sponsorships. It's just me summarizing all the scientific literature on how to be happy and how to find meaning and what happiness is and how to be the sort of best version of yourself. And it's just giving you all that information. It's just this podcast online where I literally just talk about how to be happy and how to de-stress. So all these negative consequences of stress that I've just talked about, they are undoable. You can undo them. I talk about how you can undo them. And also in that same podcast, I go into all this stuff in way more detail. I tell you way, way more information about how the brain works, how the mind works, how the body works, how it all links together, how psychoneuroimmunology works. It's lots of information. And I've done it not for money or any kind of gain, but just because I'm really, really sick of misinformation online. And there's a mental health crisis, and loads of people are stressed and they are unhappy. And you go online in order to find some solutions, and you're just bombarded with loads of people giving you their opinions, and it's almost always just meaningless. It's actually usually quite toxic, counterproductive stuff. And what I wanted to do is, instead of just throwing opinions at you, give you a reliable, scientific, evidence-based, academic, peer-reviewed source of genuine information. When I say peer-reviewed, I don't mean the podcast is peer-reviewed. I mean all the scientific papers where I got that information from are peer-reviewed. It's all legitimate scientific information, and it's combined with the insights of loads of different philosophies such as Buddhism, Stoicism, the Abrahamic religions, all that kind of stuff, to give you this really well-rounded answer on happiness. And also on Polymath, I'm going to do a few episodes about happiness and how to be happy as well, because there's a really extensive scientific literature on happiness and how to be happy. It's not as if we have no idea what the answer is. It's just these answers that they're not leaving the ivory tower of academia. They're not pervading the rest of society. We have a societal value system, which, as I talk about in episode 36, is often really counterproductive to how to actually be happy and how to actually de-stress. And what I wanted to do with Understanding Happiness, Science, and the Buddha is just provide a sort of antidote for that, even though if it's an antidote of just one person projecting his voice in the vast chaos of online, of the vast chaos of the internet, even if it's not going to have any substantive changes. It's just something that I wanted to make and that I think can help you. So I'd recommend checking that out. Thank you very much for listening. I really hope that's all been useful and informative, and I hope you have a lovely day. Take care and goodbye.